And welcome everybody to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virtual Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. It's great to be with you today, rocking and rolling through the week here in the dojo. Got a great show yesterday with Ken Litchfield, our good friend, talking about the Creed. Today, we're going to talk about the Gospel Truth, my brand new book that has just come out by Emmaus Road Press. And it's how we can know what Christ taught. And today I'm going to look at a chapter in the book. I thought it was an interesting point that you normally don't find in other apologetic works, namely how Jesus taps into a methodology or a system that was already in place in Judaism to accurately transmit large amounts of data accurately. And so we're going to talk about that on the other side of the break and give you a little preview of the book. There's going to be things in the book that I can't possibly reproduce on the radio. You got to buy the hard print. Lots of cool charts and a whole bunch of looks at language and things like that. But anyway, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at my book, The Gospel Truth, and that's on the other side of the break. On this side of the break, we're going to do what we always do. We're going to take a look at the finding of fallacy. Today's informal fallacy is the ad hominem fallacy, and we're also going to meet an early church father. Today's early church father is the last of the Eastern church fathers, namely St. John of Damascus, also known as St. John Damascene. So, got lots of great stuff in store for us today. So let's begin on the right foot and greet everybody on board. So welcome aboard, everybody, all of you listening on radio around the country. Of course, all of you watching live stream on the various outlets that we live stream this show on, and you podcast peeps listening and or watching in the future through all the various distribution centers out there. It's great to have all of you with us. And, hey, it's joyous, coming off Easter. And it's great to be back in the dojo doing apologetics. Also, if you want to access this program, you can always do so. All you have to do is just go to virtualmostpowerfulradio.org. That is the official website for Virtual Most Powerful Radio, and click on Hands-On Apologetics, and boom, you got all the programs right there. By the way, you can access all of the programs Virtual Most Powerful produces right there on the website, and also keep abreast of all the great shows or events Virtual Most Powerful produces. Lots of really cool stuff there. Definitely want to check it out if you haven't checked it out. Also, I want to give the official dojo mailbox, which is questions@handsonapologetics.com. That is questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's the way to get a hold of me, folks. And I enjoy reading your responses, hearing what's going on with you, and getting guest suggestions as well. Just one announcement, talking about books. Like I said, the Gospel Truth book kind of snuck up on me. I didn't expect the release to be so soon, so I'm kind of catching up as far as promoting it. But another development in my last book, Revolt Against Reality, which appears to be selling pretty well. And thanks be to God for that. Hopefully it'll help change minds and hearts of people, help Catholics be better equipped to deal with this bizarre culture we live in, where we're basically divorced from reality. We get into the deep roots of that in the book. I know many of you just don't have time to read, and you prefer to have audiobooks. Well, hey, I got a great announcement for you. The Revolt Against Reality book is now available as audio. So you can live stream it in your car. You can listen to it while you're doing dishes. I love audiobooks. Personally, though, I'm more of a bookworm. I love making notes and margins and things like that. But when it comes to getting through works and getting broad pictures of things, I love audiobooks too. So if you're so inclined and you'd like to get Revolt Against Reality on audio, I think it's on the Catholic Answers website, which is shop.catholic.com. If not, just go to handsonapologetics.com. That's my own website. And scroll down, you'll see a picture of the latest book, The Gospel Truth, and also a picture of Revolt Against Reality. You'll see the link for the audio there. Just click on it, and you got all the information to get an audio version of the book, which I'm really fired up, because from what I understand in the industry, audiobooks are becoming more and more popular, and for good reason. It's just harder and harder to get time to sit down and read. Unfortunately. So most people just listen through live stream, and that's great. So yeah, check it out, folks. It'd be a great gift to give to a friend too. If they're wondering how in the world all this chaos came about, you get the sensei's take on that. All right. So enough about that. Let's go to our finding the fallacy for today, which is the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem, of course, is Latin for to the man. The fallacy occurs when, instead of addressing someone's argument or position, you irrelevantly attack the person or some aspect of the person who is making the argument. And the fallacious attack can also be directed to membership in a group or institution as well. The ad hominem fallacy is a sneaky one, because when someone attacks you personally, you almost instinctively want to defend yourself or just defend your group or whatever. And by doing so, what you inadvertently do is get off topic. And that's really what I think ad hominems are designed to do, is to get you off topic and get you arguing about something other than arguments and evidence. So what you need to do whenever somebody personally attacks you and you're over a position that you hold, do what I recommend and Trent Horn recommends, is absorb and redirect. Namely, concede, at least hypothetically, that's true. So if someone says, oh, you're just saying that because you're Catholic and Catholics are mean, rotten, vicious people. Say, okay, let's say hypothetically it's true. I am a mean, rotten, vicious person. And then you redirect. Nevertheless, what about my argument? Right? So absorb and redirect. And that way you avoid what I think is the deadliest aspect of today's fallacy, which is the ad hominem fallacy. All right, let's meet our early church father for today. It's John of Damascus, otherwise known as John Damascene, also known as the Golden Speaker. His given name is John Mansur. The Mansur family is named in Arabic as the Victorious, by the way. Although there are several early lives of John, that is biographies, none of them are at all reliable, according to Jurgen's Faith Early Fathers. And for a man of such renown and importance, surprisingly little can be said about his career with any great certainty. He died in the year 754 AD, in which year the Acts of the Synod referred to him as already dead. The usual date given for his death, which marks the close of the patristic age in the East, is 749 AD. But even that is by no means certain. So he closes the early church fathers period in the East. And in Arabic, Menologion says that his death, he died at the age of 104, which would put his birth around 645 AD. And again, it's hard to tell whether or not that is solid information. Talking about his family, though, the Mansurs, John's grandfather and father before him, were both occupied ministerial posts in Damascus, and first under the Byzantine rulers, and then after 636 AD under the Arab rulers of the city. John was educated by a certain Cosmas, probably a ransomed Sicilian captive who was probably John's adopted brother. With thorough knowledge of Arabic and Greek and a proficient also in the language or knowledge of the Muslim religion, John himself served the caliph's government for a time and enjoyed a position of trust, but hostility to Christianity displayed by the Caliph al-Malik, sorry about that, was such that about the year 700 AD or 720, possibly, John resigned from his civil office, and along with Cosmas, who afterwards was made bishop of Maama near Gaza, became a monk at Marsaba. There, John was ordained by the Patriarch John V of Jerusalem, sometime prior to the outbreak of the controversy over iconoclasm. As in that controversy, John was a decided anti-iconoclast and could safely speak his mind because he was physically removed from the sphere of influence of the emperors and the Byzantine court. John's theology was always orthodox, and his Christology was quite Chalcedonian. The Damascene was a fluent preacher and a prolific author. In fact, he has probably about 150 titles of his authentic works. Jurgen says there's no great originality in John's writings, but he excelled in synthesizing almost in a way that would now be called plagiarism, and in making a presentation of the faith in a style that would appeal to a broad audience. And that is our early church father for today, John Damascene. Coming up next, we're going to talk about my brand new book, The Gospel Truth. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody, to Hands on Apologetics. And so we're going to talk about my brand new book, The Gospel Truth, how you can know what Christ taught. Just came out literally just a couple of weeks ago. And quite by surprise, I thought I was going to have a couple of months to promote the book before its release. But hey, thanks be to God, it's out there. And so I got some catching up to do. And as listeners to the program, I want to give you some insights from the book so that you can help explain, defend the faith. Now, for a lot of people out there, they believe the Gospels are fabrications, they're hoaxes. How do we know that, anything about Jesus of Nazareth? In fact, there's a whole group of people called mythicists out there that believe that the Gospels were nothing more than a bunch of legends, pagan legends at that was stitched together and made into a story that designed to sell in the marketplace, which is kind of funny because, trust me, the gospel is anything but exactly what people want to hear. In some ways it is, but I mean, it really goes against the expectations of the time. So if they did that, it was designed for failure, but it succeeded. But enough of that aside. What about the Gospels? What can we say in terms of their veracity or truthfulness? Could it really just be legend, myth, maybe folklore, that maybe gullible, uneducated people just bought into? Or is there reasons to believe that the Gospels are solid truth and correctly give us what Jesus taught and did? Well, in my book, I take the perspective of just trying to lead somebody, perhaps a non-believer, maybe someone who even thinks that maybe this is all just a hoax, and give them some interesting information, that slowly I want them to do these huhs, that's interesting. I wonder why that's so. Now, to start off with, I think the big problem with people who think the Gospels are fabrications and not truthful accounts, I think it's because they forgot that the Gospels are Jewish. I know that may sound pretty strange. You would think, the Gospels, they came from Judea by Jews. Yeah, wouldn't you automatically assume that they're Jewish? Well, it's funny. A lot of people don't take that into account because that's actually very, very important. The Jews and Jewish society is one of those societies that took the transmission of teachings very seriously. And in fact, it's not by accident that when God wished to become incarnate and to reveal himself to us definitively in Jesus Christ, that he would do so within the Jewish community that he formed. and had guided and prepared. And the good reason for that is because that society actually had a mechanism by which it could pass on large amounts of information, lots of minutia, with pretty good deal of accuracy. And so what I want to do is, and I do this in the book, in this chapter, is I take a look at that mechanism, which I call the rabbi-disciple relationship. And I show basically how it works. What were the basic components for this relationship, how they passed on information? And then I go to the Gospels, and again, not looking at it as inspired writings or anything like that, but just looking at the Gospels and asking a very simple question. Did Jesus tap into this particular methodology? And if so, it would suggest that, we have a mechanism by which the Gospels relied on, and that mechanism's pretty trustworthy. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about this rabbi-disciple relationship. Now, the Jews, like I said, they had a body of teaching, especially the Pharisees. They held on to an oral law that they believed that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And so this oral law, this body of legislation, was passed on orally from generation to generation. And although they had writings, you also had this body of unwritten tradition as well. And so you needed a method to pass on this tradition accurately. And so they somehow or other formed this rabbi-disciple relationship. So let's define terms, okay? First, the term rabbi. We're very familiar with the word rabbi. What is it? It basically means my teacher or my master. So a rabbi is the one who hands on the teachings that he received from his rabbi, and he passes it on to his students. Okay? Now, the students are known as disciples. Very straightforward, right? The disciples were not just, now this is interesting and it's very important because sometimes we can make caricatures of things. The rabbi-disciple relationship, the disciples weren't these empty pots that they dumped data in, just raw data, and they were required to spit out the raw data perfectly. Okay, that was not what this relationship was. The relationship between a rabbi and his disciples was not only to pass on teaching accurately, but to form them to become rabbis so that they in turn can make disciples. So it wasn't just passing on data. It was also forming them and informing them, training them to be able to not only teach accurately, but to engage the material in such a way that it becomes part of them. Okay, so there's a great deal of formation that goes on in the rabbi-disciple relationship. And within this relationship, there's various aspects that enable the disciple to accurately, engage the rabbi and become like the rabbi. So I want to go through some of these aspects, some of these highlights. And I think we can appropriate this to the things we know today. For example, one major motivation for knowing and memorizing and retaining and becoming part of a rabbi's teaching is the prestige of the rabbi himself. This is a little hard for us to understand in modern times because think about the people that are held up on high esteem, put on pedestals, if you will. It's not your parish priest, unfortunately. It should be, but it isn't. Or a bishop or what have you. The people society put on pedestals are entertainers, singers, maybe even politicians. I don't know. Maybe that's so that it's easier to aim rotten fruit at or something. But those are the people that are held in high prestige, right? But in the first century Judaism, the rabbi was actually kind of the superstar. He was a mover and shaker in society. And so if you have a prestigious rabbi, That's a very strong motivation to be a sponge and soak up everything you can about the person. Now, this part, I think we can relate, right? Because how many people, especially younger people, have a particular singer that they just go gaga over, right? Or a particular actor or actress, you know, people that you put on pedestals, people you have posters, maybe, I don't know, you know all their movies, you know all their songs. You're thoroughly engaged as in part of fandom, right? And now think about it, you hold this person in high esteem. What would you do, rather, if you were able to sit down with that person and have a discussion with them, or maybe they could train you to be a singer or an actor or whatever, right? You would soak it up. You would remember every syllable that was spoken, because after all, I mean, this is the pinnacle, the person that highest prestige in your eyes. The same is true in the first century Judaism. A prestigious rabbi was like a superstar like that, and you would hang on every word that the rabbi had to say and teach, and every mannerism, and just like someone in fandom today who would absorb everything a rock star would have if you had a one-on-one meeting or you're with a group of people. And that's one of the working mechanisms of this rabbi-disciple relationship, is the prestige of the rabbi. So, this isn't surprising. Disciples would try to seek out the most prestigious of all rabbis, right? It'd be like going to the best college. You want to put the applications out for the best education that you can get. The same thing's true with disciples. They would seek out prestigious rabbis, and they would honor them to an amazing degree. In fact, if you look at some rabbinic literature, they promote that honoring rabbi to the point where actually it almost dwarfs the Ten Commandments for honoring your father and mother, that you should actually honor the rabbi more than father and mother. That's how much rabbis were expected. So, in fact, I have a quote here. The rabbis required their pupils to the utmost reverence, surpassing the honor felt to parents. Let thine esteem for your friend border on your respect for thy teacher, and respect for your teacher on reverence for God. Another quote, respect for a teacher should exceed the respect for a father. For both father and son owe respect to a teacher. So the rabbi was to be held in the greatest respect, even higher esteem given to him than even a parent or a father. So that's one aspect. So you can see where if this is true and you're living in that culture, if you're sitting under a prestigious rabbi, you're going to want to absorb every syllable. And that brings up the second point. By the way, I follow theologian Emanuel Schur in this. He did a definitive work looking at various aspects of this rabbi-disciple relationship. And one of the things that the rabbis used to promote memorization probably won't shock a lot of the older people here. It could shock the younger people, but it is repetition. Okay, rigorous repetition for memorization. The rabbis would repeat over and over again the same lesson in order to drill it into their students. So those who remember the Baltimore Catechism and your instruction in it, chances are, yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The teacher was obliged to repeat his matter again and again with his pupils, and hence the rabbinic dictation to repeat means exactly the same as to teach. So think about that. So to teach would be the same thing as to repeat. And so repetition was part of this instruction, and we got a lot more to go. So stay tuned, folks. I hear the music coming up. We're going to talk more about this rabbi-disciple relationship and Jesus tapping into it right after this. And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting about my brand new book, The Gospel Truth. How can you know what Jesus taught? And yeah, in fact, I'm headed down to Steubenville this Thursday and going to meet Scott Hahn and the rest of the gang there and folks at Emmaus Road Press. Maybe do some interviews, podcasting to promote the book. That's going to be a ton of fun. So please keep me in your prayers for Thursday. But today we're talking about this section in the Gospel Truth. Like I said, a lot of people think the Gospels are just myths, legends. Maybe they're even hoaxes that were concocted by taking legends and stitching them together and so on and so forth. And what I said was the first problem is no, these are Jewish documents. And Judaism in the first century already had a well-developed system for passing on information accurately called the rabbi-disciple relationship. And before the break, we went over one aspect of it, namely the esteem of the rabbi. The esteem of the rabbi commands the disciples strict attention and devotion to detail. Just like if you were going to meet your all-time favorite rock star or movie legend or somebody, you would hang on every word. You remember every syllable. Well, same thing's true for rabbis in the first century. Another thing is the rabbis were obliged to repeat his information, his material over and over again. And, this rote repetition ingrains the material in the minds of his disciple. Another thing, too, and again, it's not just the passing on of raw data. It's the formation of the disciples that's important. It becomes part of them. They're essentially, they're lawyers being trained in the law and how to argue from the law and how to apply the law. So instruction wasn't just repeating, it was also dispositional. The rabbis would constantly be questioning the disciples, and the disciples would at times question the rabbi. So, certain cases of law, if you will, would be posed to the rabbi, or the rabbi might pose it to his disciples, and they would work it out together. Right? So it was this training and instruction. Another aspect, too, of the rabbi-disciple relationship is that the disciples' duty was to keep everything faithful in memory. This was held in very high esteem. If you are a good disciple, you should be able to remember everything faithfully. In fact, they were compared to well-lined lime containers that wouldn't spill a drop of instruction that was put into them. So that was the goal of being a disciple. And finally, a good disciple would never teach anything otherwise than what was delivered to them, even to the point of copying the expressions used by his teacher. And this comes directly from rabbinic literature that we have. Now, I actually experienced this in my apologetics career twice, I think, in my life. It's a little freaky when you see it. But I've encountered people who, let's say they're Catholics, they fell away from the faith because they were really admirers of some particular preacher somewhere. And usually the preacher would be from the South. And of course, I live around the Midwest Command Center, so I'm in the upper Midwest. And you would talk to this person, and they would talk back to you with the same Midwest accent. But when they start talking theology, they would actually change the way they talk. They would have a Southern drawl, and they would use expressions that they didn't use before. And the whole reason was because they were junkies of this particular person. They listened and re-listened to everything they taught, and they were admirers of them. And they actually take up expressions, even with the accent of these people. And like I said, I've experienced this twice in my career, and it's a little freaky, And I can see where that happens, because I used to be a St. Joseph Communications, now the Catholic Resource Center junkie, a tape junkie. I used to listen to Scott Hahn and all the great tapes that Terry Barber put out, and re-listen to them until like there's no fidelity, as you could barely hear it. And I bet I could, and probably did, sometimes slip into the Scott Hahn mode every now and then or something like that. But that's the same thing true with a good disciple in the first century, that they were not allowed to teach anything other than what was delivered to them. and including even the way the rabbi expressed certain things. Now, those are the 5 basic features of this relationship between rabbis and disciples. Now, the question is, when we look at the Gospels, do we have any reason to believe that Jesus tapped into this mechanism? And the answer is yeah, obviously. There is so much. For one thing, and a lot of people don't realize this, in the New Testament, Jesus is often called rabbi. We said rabbi means my teacher or my master. He's called a teacher numerous times, rabbi, by his disciples and by people who aren't part of the disciples. But, these casual observers realize that Jesus has a band of disciples like the rabbis do, and he's instructing them like the rabbis do. So when they talk to Jesus, they call him rabbi. Okay. So that's one reason to believe he's tapping into this, because the disciples are called disciples and Jesus is called a rabbi. That's pretty straightforward. Another thing, too, is Jesus' prestige as a preacher or teacher. We said that the reverence for a prestigious rabbi would actually exceed the reverence that a child would give to his parents. And that's straight out rabbinic literature. Now, did Jesus believe that? Well, you know what? There's some interesting passages that echo what we find in the rabbinic literature. For example, in Matthew 10:37-38, Jesus says, "He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." We probably heard that a million times over our lifetime. But did we know that this actually echoes what a rabbi would probably say, that he would demand reverence that would exceed even that given to parents. So you could check that one off the list as well. Prestigious rabbi. Now, the other one's a little harder to see because rabbis used instruction through repetition. The problem is with the Gospels, you don't find a lot of repetition, and you probably shouldn't expect to find a lot of repetition because, let's face it, it's hard. First, writing, everything is handwritten, and parchment's very expensive. Handwriting is very laborious. You shouldn't, if Jesus taught the same thing a million times, you wouldn't expect them to write it down a million times, right? It would be too much, too long, too expensive, and quite frankly, the readers would become very, very bored if you had all this repetition in the thing. So it's just a good editorial practice to use conciseness. In fact, all ancient documents try to be as concise as possible for those reasons, economic and labor reasons. So if there is repetition and Jesus did repeat things, chances are it wouldn't be recorded, it'd only be recorded once in the Gospels. But we do have some evidence of possible repetitions. For example, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and his Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6 are very close, but they're not identical. And that may be because it's the same material that is repeated on 2 different locations. So that's a possible instance where you have Jesus repeating lessons, and we can actually identify it within the Gospels. There certainly is tons of smaller phrases where things are repeated over and over again. I'm not going to go over them. If you get the book, The Gospel Truth, you can get all the examples right there. What about dispositional instruction? Like I said, it's not just downloading raw material, but it's actually asking questions of the disciples and the disciples asking questions of Jesus. I think that one, I don't need to go through a lot of examples because, as you know, yes, the Gospels are packed with these examples where people pose questions. The disciples pose questions to Jesus. Jesus poses questions to his disciples. How do you interpret the law? Things like that. Becoming the rabbi's image. Remember we said that the disciples aren't allowed to not only are they not allowed to add their own material or omit some of the material, but they would actually use the same expression and become almost echo chambers of the rabbi. Well, you know what? We actually find that in the Gospels. In Luke 6:40, Jesus says this, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when they're fully taught, will be like his teacher." So here you have straight from the lips of Jesus about a disciple being fully trained, being like his master, being like his teacher. And also, at the foot washing, the apostles' feet in John 13, "For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." In other words, not only does he say being a disciple is one who when fully taught, will be like his teacher, but also the deeds of Jesus are also part of the training as well. So he sets an example and the disciples follow. Now, think about that. Just sit back and think about it a little bit. That would be really cool to be in the presence of an apostle. Because if this instruction is true, it would be the next best thing to seeing Jesus. Because they would be using the teachings, they would be using the same expressions as Jesus, and their actions would be in line with what Jesus taught. So just a really cool thing to meditate and think about for those who became Christian after the resurrection. They had the next best thing with the disciples. Now, we're going to kick all of this up a couple of notches after the break. So stay tuned, everybody. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everybody. Hands On Apologetics. We're talking about my brand new book, The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught. It's put out by Emmaus Road Press. You could pick up a copy, by the way, at stpaulcenter.com. That's stpaulcenter.com. And thank you so much for allowing me to go through this and share some of this with you, because as an author, you work on things, the research and putting this together was done a long time ago. It's good to review and get excited about the material. And so we went through the rabbi-disciple relationship. And what's really cool for me is once you start looking at, did Jesus tap into this kind of training methodology that was used in the first century? All of a sudden, scripture verses start taking on all sorts of new nuances, that you just never saw before, like Jesus asking questions to the disciples asking questions to him. Boy, that fits perfectly within that rabbi-disciple relationship. Passages like Luke 6:40, disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when is fully taught, will be like his teacher. Boy, that fits perfectly with the rabbi-disciple relationship. They take on new aspects. And so what I said before the break is we're going to show something more, because Jesus was not simply a rabbi. He was a rabbi, but he was far more than a rabbi. So we're going to kick it up a couple of notches, okay? If a rabbi's prestige was a motivation for a disciple to accurately hand on what was taught, how much more when we kick it up a couple of notches? And that's what we're going to do right now. Because, Jesus was called rabbi and teacher, like we pointed out, but rabbis and disciples weren't the only mechanism in Israel that passed on information. There was also the same mechanism, or a similar one, I should say, for for a prophet and his disciples. So prophets also had a circle of followers, if you will, that they instructed. And so Jesus was more than just a rabbi. You could even say he was on the level of a prophet as well. In fact, in Mark, when the people first hear Jesus preach, They were astounded at his teachings, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So he was something more than a rabbi, right? And like I said, the prophets, he was more like a prophet. The prophets had disciples as well. You can see this in Isaiah 50, Isaiah 8. And Jesus, like a prophet, speaks and reveals God's will to us. And so there's passages, again, if you read it on this idea of Jesus being like a prophet, it kind of takes on a new quality or nuance. Like, for example, in Matthew 11, Jesus says, all things have been delivered to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son reveals him. That sounds like he's a prophet to mankind, right? And another thing that's interesting about this prophet-disciple relationship is that sometimes the prophets would give their disciples a portion of spirit, prophetic spirit. In fact, Elijah, the prophet, gave Elisha a double portion of the prophetic spirit in 2 Kings 2:9. That's interesting because Jesus gives the disciples the gift of the counselor, the Holy Spirit. In fact, in John 14:26, he says, but the counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to remembrance all that I have said to you. So a lot like, there's aspects here of this prophet-disciple relationship. And of course, if a rabbi's prestige is the motivating factor for disciples to hang on every word and repeat it and reproduce it without fail, how much more so a prophet, and indeed a prophet who gives a portion of his spirit to enable you to do just that, right? So talking about kicking up a notch, there's aspects of Jesus being a prophet and the disciples being his prophetic circle. In fact, this might shock some of you. Jesus is also called a prophet in the New Testament, along with John the Baptist. The people thought he was a prophet. Why? Well, you know what? Certainly fits the prophet's mold. But, we, as Catholics, we believe Jesus is a teacher. He is a rabbi, but he's more than a rabbi. We believe Jesus is a prophet, but he's more than a prophet. Jesus, we're going to kick it up one more enormous notch because according to the Gospels, Jesus is not just someone who speaks the Word of God, but Jesus is the Word of God. He is the living Torah. And that's an amazing thing when you think about it, because the rabbis and the scribes were experts in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, the law. In fact, Sirach says, the law is the embodiment of the eternal wisdom of God, the Creator, and a provincial guarantee of his effectual presence of God. So think about that. The Torah was seen as the very embodiment in writing of the eternal wisdom of God, the Creator. Jesus is the eternal wisdom of God, the Word of God, not incarnate in words like in the Torah, but Jesus is the living Torah. He is incarnate in flesh. Now, that raises things up a couple hundred notches from a prophet, right? Because a prophet just says what God reveals to him, right? But now you have Jesus, who is the very embodiment of the wisdom of God, something that supersedes the Torah. So if you think rabbis and scribes, if they dedicated their lives to studying the Torah, to understanding the Torah, to passing on the teachings of the Torah, if that was their motivation for generations, if Jesus is the living Torah, what do you think his disciples did? They would absorb everything he says. They would follow every word, right? They would study Jesus. It's not just a casual relationship, because his prestige goes beyond a rabbi, beyond a prophet. He's actually the living Torah of God, the very wisdom of God. And for that reason, his teaching is unparalleled anywhere in Jewish literature. In fact, let me give you, I love this quote. This is from the late Jacob Neusner, one of the foremost Jewish writers, certainly one of the most prolific Jewish writers in recent memory. He wrote a book, Rabbi Talks with Jesus. Let me look at it, make sure I get the, that's one of the books, but that's not where the quote comes from, though. But he mentions in another work, and I'll give you it, it's called The Development of Legend, Studies of the Tradition Concerning Yohanan ben Zakkai. It's a Brill book. You don't need to worry about the source, but what he says, I think, is very important. So Jacob Neusner, who, like I said, has familiarity with rabbinic literature like no one else on the planet, says this: no rabbi so important to rabbinic Judaism than Jesus was to Christianity. Let that sink in. No rabbi in the whole of Jewish history is as important to Judaism as Jesus is to Christianity. Now, this is a Jew speaking, okay? And this is someone who knows what he's talking about. He continues, none prophesied as an independent authority. Okay? None left the category of I sayings, for none had the prestige to do so. Now get that. No rabbi in Jewish history ever prophesied as an independent authority. Rabbis always teach in the name of their predecessors. So-and-so said in the name of so-and-so is usually the formula. You don't find I sayings in rabbinic literature where Gamaliel says I this or I that. He may have in real life, but that's not part of rabbinic Judaism. None of them did that because, as Neusner said, no one had enough prestige to actually be the source of this material. And yet, what do you find in the Gospels? It's littered with I sayings. Jesus saying, I say this, I say that. That's no rabbi. No rabbi would do such a thing. No one would dare do such a thing. No prophet would probably do that. You know, the prophets prophesied in the name of God, in the name of the Lord. There's no I sayings. But what do we find in the Gospels? We find Jesus giving I sayings, saying things by his own authority and through his own prestige. This is unprecedented. Who did Jesus think he was? The Son of God? Yeah, he did. And he was. And hence, that's what's reflected in the Gospels. And that's something very, very unique. And so, again, you know, we see evidence in the Gospels of Jesus tapping into this mechanism that the disciples certainly were trained and learned to repeat what Jesus said. That he received a provision of the Holy Spirit like a prophet, you know, being part of the circle of prophets in order to remember and actually have new revelation. And Jesus is the living Torah. So he becomes the object of study. Not just saying so-and-so said in the name of so-and-so. To study Jesus is the study of the Torah for Christians. And did disciples care about what they recorded? You better believe it, because who has more prestige than God himself incarnate? And that's just looking at the gospel broadly, you know, and comparing it to what we know about this relationship of rabbis and disciples. So thanks for allowing me to bend your ear this episode. So that's just one chapter in my book. And we move on from there in the book and go into some very fascinating territory. So anybody interested, check it out. Just go to stpaulcenter.com and check out the gospel truth, how we can know what Jesus taught. And I hear the music coming up, and that means coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening, and God willing, I'll be back again tomorrow. Do this thing we call hands-on apologetics. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood.